All right, take our seats. Afternoon, colleagues, and we will roll through these. I'm going to call this hearing to order. I want to welcome today's witnesses, Mr. President, Global Affairs and Chief Legal Officer, Alphabet, Mr. Nick Clegg, President, Global Affairs, Meta, and Mr. Brad Smith, Vice Chair and President of my standing practice of educating the public about tensions and practices seeking to manipulate our country's electoral process. You know, we've all come a long way since 2017, when, as many folks may remember, there was a lot of skepticism that our adversaries might have utilized America's social media platforms for intelligence activities. It was almost 7 years ago that, in response to inquiries from this committee, that Facebook shared what would become an expansive discovery documenting Russia's tens of thousands of inauthentic accounts across Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Reddit, and even smaller platforms like Gab and Medium and Pinterest, all try to divide Americans and influence their votes. And through this committee's bipartisan investigation into the Russian interference in the 2016 election, we learned that Russia had devoted millions to wide-ranging campaigns, literally generated hundreds of millions, which sowed political division, racial division, and impersonated social, political, and faith groups of all stripes across all ends of the spectrum to infiltrate. Our committee's bipartisan efforts also resulted in a set of recommendations for government, for the private, and for political campaigns. Recommendations for which I hope today's hearing will serve as a check. These recommendations included greater information to the private sector amongst about foreign malicious activity, not domestic, foreign malicious activity. Greater transparency measures by users about that malicious activity, as well as authenticity of information presented to them. And something that didn't get a lot of attention of open source research by academic and civil society organizations to better assist platforms here and others in identifying malicious use of social media, again, by foreign actors. So let me state right now that the 2020 election, I think, was by election security experts, and I want to commend the Trump administration helping that come about. Now, it came about because the progress has been made through a combination of both bipartisan upgrades, things that folks on both sides have been for a long time, paper records, risk-limiting audits to verify results, a better postured, frankly, national security community that we have oversight on to track and expose and disrupt, and I think a pretty successful effort to share threat information about foreign influence activity with the private sector. U.S. tech companies have made progress, although, as I warned all of our witnesses, albeit uneven, since 2016. These include, and I want to cite because we were present when the three companies in front of us, and literally 24 other companies, companies where unfortunately, a lot of this is taking place now, X, formerly known as Twitter, which wouldn't even send a representative today, where 27 companies signed in Munich what was called the Tech Accord to Combat Deceptive Use of AI in 2024 election, not just in America, but around the world. And while I appreciate the voluntary commitments that were made there, it's been uneven about where's the beef, how much has actually been done. Recently, I sent letters to companies. Some came back with specificity, some of you. Unfortunately, others simply ignored even responding. And why we are doing this, and again, on a bipartisan basis, is there's 4 new factors that I think has raised my concerns dramatically. First is our adversaries realize this is effective and cheap. Putin clearly understands if he wants to try support, American support for Ukraine, weighing in and frankly putting up fake information can help him in that matter. Similarly, we've seen since the conflict between Israel and Hamas after post-October 7th, this has also been a ripe area for foreign misinformation and disinformation. And again, we've seen dramatically increase their efforts to stoke social discord in the U.S., while again seeking to shape elections. We've seen lesser from China, but there have been some efforts by China on, not at the national level, but on down ballot races where candidates. We've seen a covert influence check led by RT to bankroll unwitting U.S. political influencers on YouTube. We've seen a wide-ranging Russian campaign that, frankly, has not gotten much media attention because I think they focused on the guys in Tennessee and not some of the slaughter in our questioning where institutions like the Washington Post and Fox News, the bad guys have basically put out false information under those banners with the goal of spreading what sounds like credible-sounding narratives to really shape campaigns. And we have seen, and this committee has called this out, efforts to infiltrate American protests over the conflict in Gaza by Iranian influence operatives who, again, seek to stoke division, and in many cases, in terms of these efforts, denigrate former President Trump. I do want to acknowledge that in these recent efforts, you all have played a positive role. I want to thank Meta, and I hope our committee's interest in this subject helped move you yesterday when you guys decided to take down RT and related Russian influence operations. I want to thank Microsoft for being forward-leaning and publicly sharing information on, again, some of the Russian activities. And I want to call you guys more by Facebook and Google for the lesson form, when you were one of the first to come forward on the sources on the Iranian hacks. So compliments to all of you on that. On an overall basis, though, the scale and sophistication of the kind of attacks be escalated. When we think about AI tools, we all know about that. I think we originally thought this would be in the form of deep fakes, video and audio alteration. You're going to see AI-type tools being used to create what appears and virtually any American voter would think is a real Fox News or watch, when in reality it isn't. And unfortunately, Congress has not been able to take on this issue, but I would point out, and it's a pretty broad swath of individual states, and they range across the political spectrum, that have really put some pretty significant guardrails in place, and at least in terms of deep fake manipulation in their state elections. And that's Alabama, Texas, Michigan, Florida, and California. Way back in 2016, Russia had to create fake personas to spin wild stories. Unfortunately, we now have a case where too many Americans, frankly, don't trust QS internal agencies, to local law enforcement, to traditional media. There is increased reliance on the internet. I think most of us try to tell our kids, just because you saw it on the internet doesn't mean it's true. But the job of the adversaries to amplify things that Americans goes up dramatically. And finally, we've seen a concerted litigation campaign that has sought to undermine the federal government's ability to share this vital threat information between you guys and the government and vice versa. And frankly, a lot of those independent academic third-party checkers have been bullied in some case or litigated. For instance, we've seen the shuttering of the election disinformation work at Stanford's Internet Observatory, as well as the termination of a key research project at Harvard Shorenstein Center. We need those academic researchers in the game as that independent source. A question that really bothers me, and I know we may litigate this a bit in back, too many of the companies have dramatically cut back on their own efforts to false information. And again, we're talking about foreign sources. And we've seen the rise, and Senator Rubio and I have been on the lead on this, of a foreign-owned that has a huge reach in the case of TikTok that has huge national security concerns, and very, very glad that 80% of both the House and the Senate voted to say creative platform shouldn't be ultimately controlled by the CCP. Now, in the here we heard about what the federal government's doing to disrupt. We're going to continue to get with law enforcement and the IC before Election Day. But this is really our effort to urge you guys to do more, to kind of alert the public that this problem has not gone away. We have, Lord knows, we have enough differences between Americans that those differences don't need to be exacerbated by our foreign adversaries. Because, and again, we're not cherry picking these adversaries. These are nation states that are in the law of our country. China, Russia, Iran have been, North Korea, others have been designated as foreign adversaries. The truth is, we're 48 days away from an election, and the final point clear is that we need to do all we can before election. But I also think it's not like at the end of election night, particularly assuming how close this election will be, that this will be over. One of my gravest concerns is that the level of misinformation, disinformation, our adversaries after the polls close could actually be as significant as anything that happens up to closing of the polls on election night. With that, I appreciate you're here. And let me just, before I go to Senator Rubio, when we do the open hearings, and I appreciate Senator Cornyn's, Cotton, and a lot of my colleagues getting here early, we are going to do by seniority rather than at the gavel. With that, Senator Rubio.
Thank you for holding this hearing. Thank you for agreeing to be here. It's important. It's actually a tricky and difficult topic because I think there are two kinds of things we're trying to address. The first is generated disinformation, and I think you're going to describe some of those efforts today, but that is some foreign adversary, Iran, China, Russia, something up, and then they basically make it up, they push it out there, and they hope people believe it. It's actually something, I remember giving a speech back in 2018 or 2019 warning about AI-generated videos that were going to be the wave of the future, and in terms of trying to influence what people think and see, and we've seen some of that already play out. That's pretty straightforward. Let me tell you where it gets complicated. Where it gets complicated is there a pre-existing view that people have in American politics. I use this as an example, not because I generally agree with it, but because I think it's an important example. There are people in the United States who believe that perhaps we shouldn't have gotten involved with Ukraine or shouldn't have gotten involved in the conflict in Europe. Vladimir Putin also happens to believe and hope that that's what we will conclude. And so now there's someone out there saying something that, you agree with them or not, is a legitimate political view that's pre-existing, and now some Russian bot decides to amplify the views of an American citizen who happens to hold those views. And the question becomes, is that disinformation, or is that misinformation, is that an influence operation view is being amplified? Now, it's easy to say, well, just take down the amplifiers. But the problem is it stigmatizes the person whose view it is. Now the accusation is that that person isn't simply holding a view, they're holding the same view that Vladimir Putin happens to have on that one topic or something similar to what he has, and as a result, they themselves be an asset. And as we try to manage all of this, we recall that in 2020, this is now well known, obviously it's been well discussed, there was a laptop, Hunter Biden's laptop, there was a story in the New York Post, and 51 former, and I say former because I have people coming up all the time saying intelligence officers are former intelligence story. Something that I imagine, but also happened to be factual. We know, based on the letter from the CEO of Meta, that the government pressured him COVID pandemic to censor certain views, and he expressed regret about agreeing to some of that. And so there are people in this country that had their accounts locked or even got, in some cases, canceled out because they questioned the efficacy of masks, something we now know Dr. Fauci, not a solution to all the problems, that questioned whether there was the lab leak, or put out the lab leak theory that at one time was considered a conspiracy and a flat-out lie. And now our own intelligence agencies are saying it's 50% likely, just as likely as the natural occurring. So this is a tricky minefield. And it's even trickier now because, Russia's still doing it more than anybody else, but the others, you don't expensive operation to pursue some of this. I think we should anticipate that in the years to come, and it's happening already, the Iranians are going to get into this. They already are. The Chinese are going to get into this business. They already are. And you see them using that in other countries to sow discord and division. It's coming. It's also North Korea, multiple, and maybe even friendly states who have a preference on how America. So I do think it's important to understand what our policies are today in terms of identifying what is disinformation, what is actually generated by a foreign adversary versus the amplification of a pre-existing belief in America, which has left a lot of people in a position of being labeled collaborators, and views that on that one issue happen to align with what some other country hopes we believe as well. And I'm very interested to learn what our internal policies are in our companies, because I think it's a discord, and that's one of the dangers that we're now flirting with. So thank you for being here. I look forward to hearing your testimony.
And before I go, I just want to reemphasize, agree with Senator Rubio. Americans, what are they? They have First Amendment right to say that. Whether we agree, disagree, no matter how crazy. I do think there's a difference when foreign intelligence services cherry pick information and amplify it, that in many ways stokes division. And that's, again, where the core of this debate is, and we're anxious to hear your testimony. I'm not sure who drove the short straw to go first.
Okay. Chair Warner, Vice Chair Rubio, members of the committee, thank you all for the opportunity to be with you today. Google Alphabet is in the business of earning the trust of our users. We take seriously the importance of protecting free expression and access to a range of viewpoints, while also maintaining and enforcing responsible policy frameworks. A critical aspect of that responsibility is doing our part to protect the integrity of democratic processes around the world. That's why we've long invested in significant new capabilities, updated our policy, introduced new tools to address threats to election integrity. We recognize the importance of enabling people who use our services in America and abroad to speak freely about the political issues that are most important to them. At the same time, we continue to take steps to prevent the misuse of our tools and our platforms, particularly attempts by foreign state actors to undermine democratic elections. To help advance this work, we created the Google Threat Intelligence Group, which combines analysis, monitors, and tackles threats, including coordinated influence operations and cyber espionage campaigns. We disrupt activity on a regular basis, and we publish our findings. And we provide expert analysis on threats originating from the kinds of countries we were talking about: Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, as well as from the criminal underground. This year alone, we've seen a variety of malicious activity, including cyber attacks, efforts to compromise personal email accounts of high-profile political actors, and influence operations that are seeking to sow discord among Americans, the way you were both discussing. We remain on the lookout for new tactics and techniques in both cybersecurity and disinformation campaigns. We are seeing some foreign state actors experimenting with generative AI to improve existing cyber attacks, like probing for vulnerabilities or creating spear phishing emails. Similarly, we see generative AI being used to more efficiently create fake websites, misleading news articles, and robotic social media posts. We have not yet seen AI bring about a sea change in these attacks, but we're new attack vectors. To help us all stay ahead, we continue to invest in state-of-the-art capabilities to identify AI. We've launched SynthID, an industry-leading tool that watermarks and identifies AI-generated content in text, in audio, in images, and in video. We were also the first tech company to require on YouTube, when creators upload content, we now require them to indicate whether it contains altered or synthetic material that appears realistic, which we then label appropriately. And we will soon begin to use content credentials. That's a new form of tamper-evident metadata coming out of the C2PA program that we'll discuss, I'm sure, to identify the provenance of content across ads, search, and YouTube, and to help our users identify AI-generated material. We, our users, industry, law enforcement, and civil society all play important roles in safeguarding election integrity. We encourage our high-risk users, including elected officials and candidates, to protect their personal and official email accounts, and we offer them our strongest set of cyber protections, our Advanced Protection Program. We also work across the tech industry, including through the Tech Accord that you mentioned, Chair Warner, and the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, the C2PA group I mentioned, to identify emerging challenges and to counter abuse. We are committed to doing our part to keep the digital ecosystem safe, reliable, and open to free expression. We appreciate the committee convening this important hearing, and we look forward to answering your questions.
Well, thank you, Chairman Warner. Thank you, Vice Chairman Rubio. It's a pleasure to be here, and I first want to say, many days we are competitors, but I think when it comes to protecting the American public, all three of us and all of us across the tech sector are and need to be colleagues committed to a common cause of protecting our elections. And I think we have to start by recognizing that there are real and serious threats, including in this election. We've all been reporting on them, we've been seeing them, and you've talked about them. Every day we know that there is a presidential race between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. But this has also become an election of Iran versus Trump and Russia versus Harris. And it is an election where Russia, Iran, and China are united with a common interest in discrediting democracy in the eyes of our own voters and even more so in the eyes of the world. So what do we do? What is the role and responsibility of the tech sector? That's the fundamental question you have put to us. First, I think we should always adhere to two principles. The first is to preserve the fundamental right to free expression that is enshrined in our Constitution that Vice Chairman Rubio spoke about. That is and needs to be our North Star. And the second is to defend the American electorate from foreign nation states who are seeking to deceive the American public. How do we do this? I think we have three roles. The first is really to prevent foreign nation-state adversaries from exploiting American products and platforms to deceive our public. We do that with guardrails, especially around AI-generated content, but we also do it by identifying and addressing content on our platform, especially AI-generated content created by foreign states. I think our second role is to protect candidates, the people who are putting themselves out there to run for office, their campaign staffs, the political parties, the county and state election officials on which we all rely. And we do that in part by providing them with technology and know-how. Google, Microsoft, we all do that. And we do it by getting out there and working with them. At Microsoft, we've now worked across 23 countries this year. We've had more than 150 training sessions reaching more than 4,700 people. And we do it by responding immediately in real time when incidents arise, as we do, to work with campaigns to help protect them. And the third role we play, quite possibly the most important, is to build on your leadership in having this hearing. to prepare the American public for the risks ahead. We do that by informing them, encouraging them to check what they see, to recheck it before they vote. And we do it by, I think, recognizing that there is a potential moment of peril ahead. Today, we are 48 days away from this election, as you said, Chairman Warner. The most perilous moment will come, I think, 48 hours before the election. That's the lesson to be learned from, say, the Slovakian election last fall and other races we have seen. I think above all else, even in a country that has so many divisions, I do hope we can all remember one thing. If Google and Microsoft and Meta can get together, if Republicans and Democrats and independents can work together, then I think we have an opportunity as a country to stand together, to ensure that we, the people of the United States, will choose the people who lead us, and we will protect ourselves from foreign interference and deception. Thank you very much.
Chairman Warner, Vice Chairman Rubio, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. At Meta, we are committed to free expression. Each day, more than 3 billion people around the world use our apps to make their voices heard. By the end of this year, more than 2 billion people will have voted in elections around the world, and we are proud that our apps help people participate in the civic process. No tech company does or invests more to protect elections online than Meta, not just during peak election seasons, but at all times. We have around 40,000 people overall working on safety and security, and we've invested more than $20 billion on safety and security since 2016. Meta has developed a comprehensive approach to protect the integrity of elections based on several key principles. First, we have strong policies designed to prevent voter interference and intimidation. Second, we connect people to reliable voting information. Third, we work tirelessly to combat foreign interference and the spread of misinformation. And finally, we lead the industry in transparency for political advertisements. Our approach reflects the knowledge gained from prior elections, and we continue to adapt to stay ahead of emerging challenges. One of the most pressing challenges for the industry is people seeking to interfere with elections to undermine the democratic process. We constantly work to find and stop these campaigns across our platforms. This is an adversarial space, and we are often responding to urgent situations with imperfect information. We may not always get it right. So we need to be cautious, and in each case, we need to conduct our own independent investigation to identify what is and is not interference. Where we identify coordinated inauthentic behavior, we remove the networks at issue. In fact, we have removed over 200 such networks since 2017, including networks from Russia, Iran, and China. We remain committed to stopping these threats, and we are constantly improving and evolving our defenses to stay ahead of our adversaries. I'm pleased to appear beside other industry leaders today, and it underscores an important point. People trying to interfere in elections rarely target a single platform. Cross-industry collaboration, transparency, and reporting are essential to tackle these networks across the internet. And that is why we publicize our takedowns for all to see and share the relevant information we learn with researchers, academics, and others, including, of course, Congress. This year, elections are also taking place as more people are using AI tools. To date, we have not seen generative AI-enabled tactics used to subvert elections in ways that have impeded, so far, our ability to disrupt them. However, we remain vigilant and will continue to adapt as the technology does as well. We know that AI progress and responsibility can and must go hand in hand. That is why we are working internally and externally to address the risks of AI. We have implemented industry-leading efforts to label AI-generated content, giving people greater context for what they are seeing. And of course, we are working across industry to develop common AI standards. And we are proud to have signed onto the White House's voluntary AI commitments and the tech accord to combat deceptive use of AI in 2024 elections, both of which will help guide the industry towards safer, more secure, and more transparent development of AI. Every election brings its own challenges and complexities. We are confident our comprehensive approach can help protect the integrity of not only this year's elections in the United States, but elections everywhere. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for your, I want to put up the first two presentations. Let me add to what Mr. Smith said. I concur that the 48 hours before the election, but I would argue the 48 hours after the polls close, particularly if we have as close an election as we anticipate, could be equally, if not more significant in terms of spreading false information, disinformation, and literally undermining the tenets of our democracy. Now, there was a lot of press attention recently on the Department of Justice indictment of the Canadians in Tennessee who were paying off influencers, knowingly or unknowingly. What didn't get much attention is the first slide here, where under the banner of Fox News and the Washington Post, these look exactly like Washington Post and Fox News. Matter of fact, it may not be what we thought of as AI, but these are kind of AI techniques to make this so real. Matter of fact, they've even got real authors' bylines. And the balance of the ads and other things are totally reflective. This came out of this DOJ indictment. I guess the question in these are, Nick, you mentioned comprehensive. They appeared on your site. They also appeared on Twitter's site, X's site. I think it is a real shame that in the previous investigations, Twitter was a very collaborative entity. Under X, they are absent, and some of the most egregious activities taking place. But I'm not sure any American, even a technology-savvy American, is going to figure out that these are fake. So where does that responsibility lie? Shouldn't your efforts have been able to spot that, and how do we make sure, because only after the fact in 2016, we didn't have real-time numbers of how many Americans were viewing the fake sites, and they literally ended up of, hundreds of millions. I still remember both the Tennessee Republican Party and the Black Lives Matter site. The real sites had less viewership than did the Russian-based sites. How does this get through? How do we know how extensive this is? And we have many, many more of these. What are we going to do about it in these next 48 hours to make sure that Americans are informed to beware? Mr. Clegg.
Well, firstly, Senator, you're absolutely right that it is a hallmark of Russian foreign interference in the democratic process to generate AI stories resembling real media. As it happens, since those appeared on our site, we have just over the last 48 hours banned the organization that spawned a lot of this activity, the disinformation, Rossiya Zavodnya, not least after the editor-in-chief gave an interview where she said publicly, and this is in effect a media organization owned and run out of the Kremlin, that she, and I quote, at least this is the translation, her and her team are conducting what she called guerrilla projects in the heart of American democracy. And the panel behind you is a manifestation of that. That is one of the reasons why...
I want to make sure I get to my second. I need to know how many Americans viewed this and other Russian-generated Facebook sites that appear to be media sources. I hope to get that information as soon as possible. I also want to indicate there is still an effort, and this is more over here, in terms of targeting by the Russians towards specific groups. In this case, it was the Doppelganger Gang, and it was both on Jewish Americans, and then one targeted towards Latino community. They're very sophisticated. I guess it wouldn't be jaw-dropping that they're focused most of their efforts on the same 6 states that that everybody else is focused on. But, and this again goes more to both Mr. Clegg and Mr. Walker, they're still targeting paid advertising. We remember in 2016 when we didn't even have controls when Russians were paying with rubles for paid advertising on sites. I would have thought 8 years later we would be better at least screening the advertising. Again, in case of YouTube and in case of Facebook, what are we doing to stop the paid advertising targeting by these adversaries?
Since Nick took the last one, I can start on this one. We have an extensive series of checks and balances in our advertising networks that are designed to identify problematic accounts, particularly around election ads. We require election ads to have registration effectively. And in the 2016 situation, I remember we did an extensive forensic review of our systems and found that less than $4,000 had been spent on our networks.
Respectfully,
Sir.
As recently as January, I wrote the Treasury Department that said, both of your companies have still repeatedly allowed Russian influence actors, including sanctioned entities, to use your ad tools. We will get that specific information to you, and we're going to really need as soon as possible the content, the bad actors, how much content have they purchased on both of your sites, and frankly others. And we're going to need that extraordinarily fast because I think they are getting through in many, many more ways than has been represented.
Certainly, I certainly appreciate the concern, and we have taken down, as we've indicated earlier, something like 11,000 different efforts by Russian associated entities to post content on YouTube and the like.
We're just going to need this as quickly as possible, both in terms of number of Americans viewing Fox News, what they think is Fox News or Washington Post, or advertisements. We need that data to make sure, again, that we inform the public. Marco.
Thank you. The area I want to focus on is where political speech is involved, and it's sort of this area I talked about in my opening statement, which is, and really in particular, I want to understand what the current policies and practices are as we speak regarding content moderation, specifically in speech. So just for, as I'm reading, and I'm not reading the opening statement from Meta, we're constantly working to stop the spread of misinformation and disinformation. We have built the largest independent fact-checking network of any platform, nearly 100 partners from around the world, to review and rate viral misinformation in more than 60 languages. Stories that this platform, or these group of people rate as false, are shown lower in feed. And if some page repeatedly creates or shares misinformation, we significantly reduce their distribution and remove their advertising rights. Let me explain. We're not talking about the stuff that was up here. That's fake content. That's just purely fake content. It's generated to look like Fox News or Wall Street Journal, New York Times. That's not, no one's arguing that. That's fake. That should be taken down. Those companies should want it taken down. That's their copyright and their logo and their letterhead. I'm talking about this. So you've got a group of people that I think are your fact checkers from all over the world to determine where something is true or not. So let me take you back to a real world scenario, which ties into what the CEO of the company said, and that is there were people at one point saying, maybe I believe that the pandemic began in a lab. I believe there was an accident in the lab and it leaked out. And at one time, that was considered not factual. And in fact, there was pressure from government officials on companies not to report on that. How would that work today? A story like that, who determines whether that's true or not? Because it wasn't true then, but all of a sudden now it is 50% maybe likely. How would something like that, because there are people that were caught up in that. I imagine that under the policies that you describe, if I was out there or someone was out there raising the specter of a potential lab leak, it would run through these fact checkers from 100 partners all over the world. They would decide whether it's true or not. And you could have your page diminished, potentially deplatformed if I write too much about it. So how does this policy deal with that problem that I just described, which is a real world one?
Senator, yes, indeed it is. And as I said in my opening statement, we are obviously, we all inhabit a world of imperfect information and crucially, and I think the pandemic was a very good example of that, information which changes. And obviously with the benefit of hindsight, we now understand the epidemiology of the pandemic, which we didn't at the time. When we were in the middle of the pandemic, prior to the vaccines being rolled out, when people were dying, when really no one knew what the trajectory was of this global pandemic, we as an engineering tech firm, of course, we're not specialists in
Yeah, but I'm not asking what happened. I understand what happened. I want to know how this policy today would prevent that from happening. Because if the government is telling you this is a lie, we have proof that it's a lie, take it down, and your fact checkers say it's a lie, then my account gets blocked, gets diminished today, if that happened today.
Right.
Now.
So two things. Firstly, we do continue to rely on these independent fact checkers. We don't employ them. They're not part of Meta. They're independently vetted by a third-party organization.
Who are they?
Oh, there's a variety of organizations which specialize in examining what they think is a reliable way of asserting whether something is missing.
Is there a way to know who those vetters are?
Oh, yeah,
Is there a
absolutely.
list somewhere? Is like a roster?
We have a full list, absolutely. We can provide them to you, and they obviously work in multiple languages, including the United States. I think there are 11 fact checkers in the United States, and we can provide you with all the information on them. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, and Mark Zuckerberg did indeed explain this in his recent letter to the House Judiciary Committee, I think we learned our lesson, certainly as Meta is concerned, that in the heat of the moment, when governments, and it's governments around the world, exert particular pressure on us, on particular classes of content which they are particularly focused on, we need to act always, and we strive to do this, but of course we make mistakes. We need to act independently, and we need to be resistant to the sort of passing moods and passions around particular bits of content, which was particularly the case during the pandemic. People were, in effect, in a panic.
Let me, in a different context, the exact same system, a laptop appears, and 51 people sign a letter saying, we used to work in the intelligence community, this is Russian disinformation, and your fact checkers say, we got to listen to the experts, they would know. Does the New York Post get their account taken down again?
So to be very clear, we did not take down the account or the content. I think X, who are not here, but they did. We did
right, but under this policy, if you deem it to not be true because it's disinformation because some guys signed a letter saying that it would lower them in the feed and potentially reduce their distribution. And if they post that story too many times, you may actually lock them out.
So in this policy. Sorry, in this instance, Senator, you're correct that story was demoted in its, I mean, it was always available, millions of people saw it, but its prominence on our services was temporarily reduced, and we used to do that to allow the fact checkers to give them the space and the time to choose to then examine that content. In this instance, the Hunter Biden story, they didn't do so, so that temporary demotion of a few days was then released, and it circulated.
Did the fact checkers reduce or demote the 51 people who signed the letter or the letter they signed? Because that turned out to be not true.
I don't believe they did so at the time, no.
All right, thank you.
Senator Heinrich.
So I want to stay on this same topic of the sort of fraudulent news sites that look like something people would recognize from their own news preferences. Do each of your companies have a policy of removal once you become aware of something that is clearly a fraudulent version of a legitimate site?
I think the answer is yes, and Vice Chairman Rubio, I thought, captured it very well. It actually, in my view, does not depend on whether the topic had anything to do with politics. Those are counterfeit sites. Those are people using the trademarks of Fox News and the Washington Post without their permission and in a way that deceives the public and diminishes the value of those companies. And so, yes, and I think you'd see pretty universally across the industry terms of use that prohibit that.
Why does it seem to take as long as it does for those sites to be identified and removed? I know they remain up sometimes longer than I think most of us would hope or expect. And then have you been able to use AI proactively to identify some of those fake news outlets?
I think increasingly we are using AI to detect these kinds of problems, and I think AI is especially good at detecting the use of AI to create content. That's one of the things we do. And we are able to see things faster. You always have to be in a race. But for example, just this morning, we saw a Russian group put online an AI-enhanced video putting into Vice President Harris's words at a rally words she never spoke. And so I think that is one of the goals for all of us to keep pursuing, to identify these things faster and then, where appropriate, take action.
Yeah. I'm encouraged because obviously AI is being used offensively, and we need to be on our game and responding with those same tools to be able to identify and appropriately deal with these things on a much faster rate. At a hearing of the U.S. House Committee on House Administration last week, New Mexico's Secretary of State testified that, quote, years of false election claims and ideological attempts to discredit our voting systems and processes have led to increased threats and harassment to election workers, end quote. How have you sought to improve your platform's ability to detect and remove content that actually threatens or harasses people who are part of the democratic process and apparatus for fairly administrating elections?
I'm happy to take that. And I suspect the same is true for all of us. There are two elements of that. One is making sure that we are trying to safeguard our elections officials against threats that may be posted online. And I'm confident that all of our companies have policies against incitements to violence, direct threats, bullying, cyber attacks, et cetera. So that kind of material would come down. The second half is helping our election officials be more protected themselves through the use of some of the tools that we have spoken about, like the Advanced Protection Program, so their information is not being hacked or doxed, et cetera. The personal information is not being made public and the like. So between the various companies here, including I know our Mandiant group, has worked with a number of election officials and agencies to make them more cyber resilient, if you will, so more robust against cyber attack.
Mr. Clegg.
And Senator, again, I'm sure this is in common for all of those represented here, but we also encourage local election officials to use our platforms to communicate with voters. So we established a system called Voting Alerts, and I think since we established that program in 2020, around 650 million voting alerts have been issued by local and state officials on Facebook's apps and services, so that voters are properly informed about where and when to vote.
I'm going to give the rest of my time back. Very uncharacteristic for this
very
body,
rare,
but
exactly.
nonetheless.
I'll take it.
Senator Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Clegg, we've received briefings from the intelligence community that indicate that China is not focused on the presidential election race, but rather on down-ballot races at the state level, county level, local level. And that concerns me because officials at those levels are far less likely to receive the kinds of briefings that we receive, or to get information from Homeland Security or the FBI on how to be on alert. In addition, China is attempting to build relationships with state and local officials. We see the sister city programs. We see the Confucius Institutes and educational institutions. So how are your platforms attempting to help safeguard the down-ballot races? The presidential race, I think everybody's aware of the risk there, but the down-ballot is what really concerns me.
And Senator, I think you're right to be concerned, and that's why our vigilance needs to be constant. It can't just sort of peak at the time of the presidential elections. It's something which we need to deploy our policies and our enforcement around the world and around the clock. And you're also right, Senator, to point out that what we have at least seen, I'm interested in what my colleagues have witnessed, but what we have at least seen is that from what we call coordinated inauthentic behavior networks conducted by China, some of them are quite specifically targeted at particular communities. So, for instance, quite recently we disabled dozens of Facebook and Instagram accounts which were targeting the Sikh community in the United States. And that is one of the reasons why the central signals that we look for aren't related to the content or even the person, but the behavioral patterns that we see. And the telltale patterns are most especially the use of a network of fake accounts. And that, of course, then manifests itself in lots of different ways, is targeted at different communities. But the underlying analysis that our teams conduct is about the behavior rather than the individual bit of content. Because, as Vice Chairman Rubio said, sometimes the content can be actually consistent with things that are circulated by kind of ordinary folk in kind of the normal day-to-day business.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, you talked about the need for the American people to be prepared.